Desmond Doss. They warned mercy dies first in war. He carried it through the smoke. The smoke came first, before the screaming. Private First Class Desmond Doss had learned that pattern on Hacksaw Ridge. Smoke meant something was burning up there on the plateau, and what burned was rarely just equipment. He stood at the base of the escarpment, one hand wrapped around the rope anchored to the cliff face, feeling the fibers slick with morning dew and something darker. Above, where the 77th Infantry Division held ground they'd paid for in blood, smoke rolled across the ridge like storm clouds, thick and grey and restless. Through that curtain came the sounds, rifle cracks, the dull thump of mortars, and underneath it all, voices calling out in pain. Captain Reynolds appeared from the command post tent, his face lined with exhaustion. The assault had started before dawn, a push to clear Japanese positions clustered in caves along the eastern edge of the ridge. 3 hours later, half of B Company was pinned down somewhere in that smoke, and the other half huddled at the cliff base, waiting. Reynolds looked at the rope, then at Doss. Nobody said what they were both thinking. The rope had already gone up 6 times that morning, lowering wounded men who'd been dragged to the cliff edge by whoever was still moving up there. "They're calling for a medic again," Reynolds said quietly. His voice carried the flatness of a man who'd stopped expecting miracles. "Howell says visibility is maybe 10 feet. You can't even see where the Japanese positions are anymore." Doss checked his aid bag, fingers moving through the familiar inventory. Bandages, morphine syrettes, sulfur powder, tourniquets. Less than he'd started the day with. He'd already treated 12 men at the bottom of the cliff, burns, shrapnel wounds, broken bones from the descent. Some would live, some wouldn't. Behind Reynolds, Sergeant Howell stood with his arms crossed, watching Doss with an expression caught between respect and something harder to name. "I told you at morning briefing," Howell said. "War kills mercy first. That smoke up there, it'll kill you just as dead as a bullet. You won't see what's coming." Doss met his eyes. "Then I guess I better listen real careful." He'd heard Howell's speech before. Mercy was a luxury that died on contact with real combat. The Okinawa campaign had proven that to plenty of men. But standing there at the base of Hacksaw Ridge, watching smoke pour over the cliff edge like water, Doss felt something stubborn and quiet settle in his chest. Mercy didn't have to die first. Someone just had to be willing to carry it. The rope trembled in his hands, a signal from above. Someone up there was moving, preparing to send another wounded man down. Doss tied a loop at chest height, checked the anchors, and called up. A voice answered, barely audible through the smoke and gunfire. 3 more men wounded, 1 critical, and the smoke was getting thicker, fed by a burning ammunition dump somewhere on the Japanese side. "I'm going up," Doss said. Reynolds hesitated, then nodded. 5 minutes. If we don't hear from you in 5 minutes, we're assuming the worst and pulling everyone back. Doss began climbing, hand over hand, boots scraping against wet rock, the rope burning his palms even through the calluses. The cliff face rose 70 feet, nearly vertical in places. Halfway up, he entered the smoke. The world became grey, directionless, smelling of cordite and burning wood. He could hear his own breathing, the rasp of the rope, and somewhere above, another voice calling out, hoarse, desperate, young. When his head cleared the ridge lip, the plateau stretched before him like something from a fever dream. The smoke moved in thick waves, revealing glimpses of shattered earth, overturned helmets, scattered equipment, shell craters filled with muddy water. The Japanese positions were invisible, but their presence pressed against the air, the occasional crack of a rifle, the metallic clink of a mortar tube being loaded, and somewhere in all that grey uncertainty, men were dying. A hand grabbed his shoulder. Private Miller, his face streaked with soot, pulled Doss into a shallow crater. "Thank God. We got 3 down. Johnson took shrapnel to the leg, Ramirez can't breathe right, and there's a kid from 2nd Platoon, I don't even know his name, but he's losing blood fast." Doss looked at Miller's eyes, wide, exhausted, the whites showing too much. "Where?" "Spread out, maybe 30 yards between them." Miller swallowed hard. In the smoke. You can't see more than a few feet, and the Japanese are in there too. We hear them moving around. The smoke shifted, and for just a moment Doss saw the ridge clearly. The line of shallow foxholes where B Company had dug in, the open ground beyond, and the tree line where muzzle flashes occasionally sparked. Then the grey curtain fell again, swallowing everything. "Get me to Johnson first," Doss said. "If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters." They crawled through the smoke on their bellies, moving by sound and memory. The plateau of Hacksaw Ridge was maybe 200 yards across, pockmarked with shell craters that became traps in the grey blindness. Doss kept one hand on Miller's boot, following him toward where Johnson had gone down. The smoke tasted like burning metal and something organic he didn't want to identify. Every few seconds, a rifle shot cracked somewhere in the haze, Japanese or American, impossible to tell. Johnson lay behind a splintered tree stump, his right leg torn open from hip to knee. He'd tried to wrap it himself, but the bandage was already soaked through. When he saw Doss, his face crumpled with relief. "Thought you weren't coming. Thought they'd pulled everyone back." "Not everyone," Doss said. He cut away the makeshift bandage, packed the wound with sulfur powder, applied a proper dressing. His hands moved automatically, while his mind tracked sounds. Footsteps in the smoke maybe 20 yards away, speaking Japanese. A mortar coughed somewhere to the left. The metallic scrape of someone loading a rifle very close. Miller pressed against the stump, his rifle pointed at nothing visible. "We should have pulled back an hour ago. Captain's orders were to hold this line, but half the company's scattered, and nobody knows where the hell the enemy actually is. This smoke, it's making everyone blind and trigger-happy." Doss gave Johnson morphine, then fashioned a drag sling from Johnson's own webbing. "Help me get him to the cliff edge." The three of them moved in a stumbling crawl, Doss and Miller pulling Johnson between them. The smoke parted and closed around them like a living thing. Twice they passed within feet of other soldiers, Americans in foxholes, faces pale and dirt-streaked, watching them with expressions somewhere between hope and accusation. Nobody offered to help. The unspoken rule on Hacksaw Ridge was brutally simple. Don't draw attention. Don't make yourself a target. Don't stand up in the smoke because the Japanese were out there watching for movement. They reached the cliff edge after 10 minutes that felt like an hour. Doss secured Johnson in the rope loop, gave Miller the signal, and watched as Johnson disappeared over the edge, lowered hand over hand by the men below. The rope came back up empty, wet and fraying in 2 spots Doss hadn't noticed that morning. "Ramirez next," Miller said. "But he's on the other side of the ridge, past where 2nd Platoon is supposed to be holding. If they're even still there." Doss looked at the rope, then back into the smoke. Somewhere in the grey, Japanese soldiers were moving with the same uncertainty, the same fear. The 77th Infantry Division had been fighting on Okinawa for weeks, and everyone knew the pattern. The Japanese would wait in the smoke and confusion, then counterattack when visibility was worst. The smoke worked both ways. It protected the wounded, but also hid the enemy. A runner appeared from nowhere, materializing out of the haze. He was young, maybe 18, his uniform torn and his hands shaking. "Message from Captain Reynolds. We're pulling back in 15 minutes. Everyone off the ridge. Japanese are massing for a counterattack." Miller's face went white. 15 minutes? What about the wounded?" The runner shook his head. "Captain said get who you can. The smoke's too thick. We're losing cohesion up here." Doss felt something cold settle in his stomach. He looked at Miller, then at the smoke where Ramirez and the unknown kid from 2nd Platoon were waiting. 15 minutes. Maybe enough time to reach one of them, not both. And then everyone would be gone, and the wounded would be alone when the Japanese came through. "You go down," Doss said to Miller. "I'm getting the others." "That's insane." Miller grabbed his arm. "You heard the runner. 15 minutes and then this ridge belongs to them again." Doss pulled free. "Then I better move fast." He disappeared into the smoke before Miller could argue further. Behind him, he heard Miller cursing, then the sound of boots on rock as the runner headed back to relay messages. Doss moved alone now, one hand trailing along the ground, navigating by the slope and the feel of the earth. The smoke pressed against his face like a physical weight, and somewhere ahead, someone was calling for a medic in a voice that was fading with each repetition. The smoke played tricks with sound. Voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the broken ground until Doss couldn't trust his ears. He found Ramirez in a shell crater, curled on his side, one hand pressed against his ribs. Every breath whistled wrong, a sucking chest wound that Ramirez had tried to seal with his own fingers. His eyes found Doss, and something like hope flickered there, then faded to resignation. "Can't breathe right," Ramirez whispered. "Feels like drowning." Doss worked fast, sealing the wound with a field dressing, taping it tight. The morphine went into Ramirez's arm, and slowly the man's breathing steadied into something more rhythmic, less panicked. But moving him would be another problem. Ramirez couldn't walk, and the crater was 50 yards from the cliff edge, through open ground. Doss glanced at his watch. 11 minutes until withdrawal. A shadow moved in the smoke, and Doss froze. The shape resolved into Lieutenant Parker, B Company's executive officer, his uniform torn and his face hollow with exhaustion. He'd been leading the assault that morning and had disappeared into the smoke hours ago. Now he crouched beside the crater, staring at Ramirez with eyes that had seen too much. "Reynolds is pulling everyone back," Parker said. His voice was flat, mechanical. "We lost contact with 2nd Platoon 20 minutes ago. The smoke's hiding a full company of Japanese moving up from the caves. They're going to hit us hard." "Then help me get Ramirez to the cliff." Parker shook his head slowly. "There's at least 3 more wounded between here and 2nd Platoon's position. 3 more men calling out, and we've got maybe 10 minutes before this whole ridge goes to hell again. You can't get them all, Doss." "I can try." "No." Parker's voice hardened. "You can't. This is what Okinawa does. This is what Hacksaw Ridge takes. You save who you can, and you leave the rest because the alternative is dying yourself for men who are already gone." Doss met his eyes. "They're not gone. They're calling for help. They're calling from the wrong side of a Japanese counterattack." Parker stood. "I'm ordering you to take Ramirez and pull back. Now." For a long moment, neither man moved. The smoke drifted between them, carrying the smell of cordite and wet earth. Somewhere in the grey, another voice called out, weaker now, almost gone. Doss thought about Sergeant Howell's words that morning. War kills mercy first. About the warnings everyone had given him since he'd refused to carry a weapon. That faith wouldn't stop bullets, that conscience was a luxury, that eventually he'd have to choose between doctrine and survival. He'd spent the whole campaign wrestling with that choice. Training had taught him field medicine, but life on Okinawa had taught him something harder, that mercy demanded more than bandages and morphine. It demanded the willingness to walk into the smoke when everyone else was walking out. "I'll get Ramirez to the cliff," Doss said quietly. "Then I'm going for the others." "That's not a request, Doss. That's an order. Get to the cliff and stay there." "I hear you, sir." Doss pulled Ramirez to his feet, supporting the wounded man's weight. "And I'll pray you're wrong about those other men." Parker watched them go, his face unreadable. Then he turned and disappeared back into the smoke, heading toward wherever B Company was gathering for withdrawal. Doss and Ramirez moved in agonizing slowness, feeling their way through the grey. Every step felt exposed, every sound like an enemy soldier drawing a bead on them. Twice they passed Japanese positions so close Doss could hear breathing, the scrape of equipment, whispered orders in a language he couldn't understand. They reached the cliff edge with 7 minutes to spare. Doss secured Ramirez in the rope, gave the signal, and watched him descend into the hands waiting below. The rope came back up. Doss looked at it, wet, frayed, the anchor points showing wear from a full day of use. Then he looked back into the smoke, where voices still called, fading, desperate. From below he heard Reynolds shouting, "Doss! Everyone's down! Move!" Doss picked up the rope. He thought about his Bible, tucked in his pack at the bottom of the cliff, about the words his mother had underlined, "Love thy neighbor as thyself," about what mercy actually meant when it was tested by fire and smoke, and the absolute certainty that going back would probably cost him everything. He tied the rope around his waist and walked back into the smoke. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The smoke thickened as Doss moved deeper into the ridge, and with it came a terrible clarity. He could hear everything now. The scrape of boots on rock as Japanese soldiers repositioned, the whispered coordination of their movements, the metallic click of rifle bolts being drawn back. They were close, hunting through the same grey blindness, and the only thing keeping both sides from tearing each other apart was the smoke itself, a temporary mercy that turned Hacksaw Ridge into a world of ghosts. He found the kid from 2nd Platoon in a collapsed foxhole, unconscious, his leg bent at an angle that made Doss's stomach turn. No time for a proper splint. Doss gave him morphine, then improvised a drag sling from the soldier's own equipment and his own belt. The kid didn't wake, which was a blessing. Doss pulled him through the smoke, navigating by feel and prayer. The rope around his waist, his only connection to the cliff edge and safety. Halfway back, a Japanese soldier appeared from nowhere, materializing from the smoke less than 10 feet away. Both men froze. The enemy soldier was young, Doss's age, his uniform torn and his rifle pointed at the ground. His eyes were wide with exhaustion and fear, the same expression Doss had seen on American faces all day. For 3 seconds that felt like forever. They stared at each other across the smoke. Then the soldier looked at the unconscious American Doss was dragging, at Doss's empty hands, and something shifted in his expression. He turned and disappeared back into the grey without firing a shot. Doss stood shaking, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. Then he kept moving. At the cliff edge, he secured the unconscious soldier and sent him down. The rope came back slower this time. The men below were exhausted, their hands raw. From the bottom, Reynolds's voice carried up, hoarse with disbelief and anger. "Doss, goddammit, I ordered withdrawal 10 minutes ago. Everyone's off the ridge but you." Doss didn't answer. He went back into the smoke. The pattern repeated. Find a wounded man by following his calls. Stabilize him enough to move. Drag him to the cliff. Lower him on the rope that was fraying more with each trip. The smoke never lifted. The Japanese never attacked, held back by their own confusion and the same deadly game of hide-and-seek that paralyzed both sides. Doss moved through it all like a man in a dream, whispering prayers between breaths, his hands moving automatically through bandages and tourniquets and morphine syrettes. On the 4th trip, he found a soldier who'd been shot in the stomach. The man was crying, not from pain but from fear, certain he'd been left behind. "They forgot me," he kept saying. "They all went down, and they forgot me." "Nobody forgot you," Doss said, though he knew it wasn't quite true. Battlefield calculus on Okinawa was brutal. Sometimes men got left behind because retrieving them cost more lives than it saved. That's what Reynolds had been trying to tell him. That's what Howell's warning meant. Mercy died first because Mercy asked too much. Doss got the soldier to the cliff and lowered him. The rope came back with visible damage now, 2 strands completely severed, the rest starting to unravel. It wouldn't hold many more trips. From below, a different voice called up. It sounded like Lieutenant Parker. "Doss, the rope's failing. 1 more and it's done." 1 more. Doss looked back into the smoke. He'd sent down 6 men, 6 lives saved that would have been lost. And somewhere in the grey, he knew there were more wounded soldiers calling out, running out of time as the smoke began to thin and the Japanese prepared for their counterattack. His hands were bleeding, torn from rope burns and rough rock. His legs trembled with exhaustion. Every muscle screamed for rest, but he could still hear them, the voices fading in the distance, the desperate calls that nobody else was left to answer. The rope around his waist felt impossibly heavy, not from its weight, but from what it represented. One final choice between pulling himself to safety or making one last trip into smoke that was already starting to clear. Doss untied the rope from his waist, secured it to the cliff anchor, and walked back toward the voices. He didn't count steps or track time. He just moved through the thinning smoke, following the sound of someone calling his name. What the after-action reports would never mention, what the citation wouldn't say, what Doss himself would struggle to explain years later when people called him a hero, was the moment he almost stopped. It came on that 7th trip, somewhere in the smoke between the cliff and the last wounded man. His body simply refused. His legs locked, his vision tunneled, his hands wouldn't stop shaking. He stood paralyzed in the grey, listening to the calling voice ahead and the voices of reason behind. Get to the cliff. Get down. You've done enough. You can't save them all. Mercy has limits. The soldier he found was Corporal Hayes from 3rd Platoon, both legs mangled by a mortar blast. Hayes had been on Okinawa since the landing, had survived 3 weeks of hell on Hacksaw Ridge, and now lay in the mud, certain he'd die here in the smoke. When Doss appeared, Hayes actually laughed. That same broken, hysterical sound Miller had made. "You're that medic, the one who won't carry a gun. They said you'd gone down already." "Not yet," Doss whispered. His voice came out wrong, distant and hollow. He worked on Hayes's legs, but his hands felt disconnected, clumsy. The bandages kept slipping. The tourniquet wouldn't tighten properly. His vision grayed at the edges, and distantly he realized he was approaching some kind of collapse. Physical, mental, spiritual. He couldn't tell anymore. The smoke pressed against him like a physical weight, and underneath it all was a truth he'd been avoiding since morning. That what he was doing wasn't sustainable, that the human body and mind had limits even faith couldn't overcome, that eventually something would break. "Leave me," Hayes said quietly. "Rope's probably gone anyway. You stay here with me. You're dead when the Japanese come through." Doss looked at his hands, shaking, bleeding, covered in other men's blood and mud. He thought about all the warnings. Howell saying Mercy dies first, Reynolds ordering him back, Parker's flat certainty that you can't save them all. They'd all been right. This was where Mercy ended, at the exact point where the body gave out, where faith met its physical limit, where staying loyal to the wounded meant dying alongside them. The smoke shifted, and through it Doss saw movement, Japanese soldiers, dozens of them, moving in formation through the thinning haze. The counterattack was coming. He had maybe 5 minutes before this whole plateau became a killing ground again. Hayes saw them too, his face going pale. "Go," he said. "For God's sake, go." Instead, Doss picked up Hayes and started dragging him. He didn't decide to move. His body just did it, running on something beyond conscious thought. Later, he'd wonder if it was faith, stubbornness, or simple refusal to accept that Mercy had limits. In the moment, he was just a terrified young man moving through smoke, pulling another broken body toward a cliff edge he could barely see. They reached the rope with Japanese voices shouting behind them. The smoke was clearing fast now, revealing the shattered landscape in harsh detail. Doss tied Hayes into what was left of the rope, a frayed, blood-soaked line that looked ready to snap. He gave the signal and watched Hayes descend, certain the rope would break, certain they'd both fall. It held, barely. When the rope came back up, Doss looked at it, then at the plateau behind him. The smoke was almost gone. He could see the Japanese clearly now, soldiers moving with purpose, reclaiming ground, finding their dead. One of them looked directly at Doss across the open space, raised his rifle, then slowly lowered it. A gesture Doss would never understand. Respect, exhaustion, or simple mercy, returned for mercy given. Doss grabbed the rope and went down. His hands slipped twice, his legs scraped against rock. Halfway down, he heard the rope snap above him, one strand parting with a sound like a gunshot. But the remaining strands held just long enough for him to reach the bottom, where hands caught him and pulled him away from the cliff face as gunfire erupted above. He collapsed into mud at the base of Hacksaw Ridge, unable to stand, unable to speak. Reynolds stood over him, his face a mix of fury and awe. 7 men. You brought down 7 men after I ordered withdrawal. That rope should have failed 4 trips ago. You should be dead. Doss looked at his hands. They wouldn't stop shaking. They never would. Not completely. Not for the rest of his life. How many did we lose up there? Reynolds was silent for a long moment. Counting the ones you saved. Less than we should have. Later, Doss would learn the official version, that he'd displayed extraordinary heroism on Hacksaw Ridge, that he'd saved numerous lives under fire, that he'd refused to leave wounded comrades behind. The citation would mention courage, faith, and devotion to duty. It wouldn't mention the moment he almost stopped, the terror that made his hands shake, the voice in his head screaming at him to run. It wouldn't mention that mercy hadn't triumphed that day. It had just barely survived, carried on bloody hands and a fraying rope through smoke that revealed everything and nothing. 3 weeks later, Desmond Doss sat in a rear area tent while a chaplain interviewed him for the official record. Outside, Okinawa's rain drummed against canvas, and the smell of wet earth mixed with disinfectant from the nearby field hospital. His hands still trembled. The doctor said it was exhaustion and shock, that it would fade with time. They were only half right. The trembling would fade, but something in his hands would remember forever. The rough bite of that rope, the weight of 7 men lowered one by one into safety. "Tell me about Hacksaw Ridge," the chaplain said. "What you did that day in the smoke." Doss struggled to find words. How could he explain that the legend everyone was building didn't match the reality, that the official report talked about heroism and faith when he remembered mostly terror and the physical impossibility of moving one more time, that the story of the unarmed medic who defied orders and saved lives sounded clean and mythic, while the actual experience had been covered in mud and blood and the desperate improvisation of a man who couldn't accept that mercy had to die. "I just kept going back," he said finally. "There were men calling for help. Leaving them didn't feel like an option." The chaplain smiled, satisfied. He had his story. Courage, faith, and selfless devotion. Doss knew better than to complicate it with the truth about paralysis and doubt, about the moment he almost broke, about the Japanese soldier who didn't fire. Some truths were too complex for after-action reports. That night, he visited the field hospital where the 7 men he'd saved were recovering. Miller was sitting up, his leg in traction, writing a letter home. Ramirez could breathe normally now, his chest wound healing clean. Hayes would lose one leg but keep the other. The doctors said his survival was a miracle of timing and field medicine. They all wanted to thank Doss, to tell him what his actions meant. He couldn't hear them properly. All he heard was the voices he'd left behind. The ones too far in the smoke, the ones the thinning haze had revealed too late, the ones calling from positions the Japanese had already overrun by the time he reached the cliff. 7 saved. How many lost? The math of mercy was unbearable. Reynolds found him outside the hospital tent, standing in the rain. The captain had aged 10 years in 3 weeks. The entire 77th Infantry Division looked like that now, worn down by Okinawa's brutal arithmetic. "They're recommending you for a Medal of Honor," Reynolds said, "for Hacksaw Ridge, for what you did in the smoke." Doss stared at his hands. "All I did was what any medic would do, what any decent person would do." "No," Reynolds' voice was firm. "Any other medic would have followed orders and pulled back. Any other person would have chosen survival over that 7th trip. What you did was carry mercy into a place where it had no business surviving. That matters, Doss. Maybe. Or maybe it just meant he'd been too stubborn, or too faithful, or too terrified of living with guilt to make the rational choice. Doss didn't know any more. The line between courage and stupidity, between faith and fatalism, felt thinner than the rope that had lowered 7 lives to safety. 2 years later, back home, he'd wake from nightmares about smoke and hear rain on the roof and smell wet rope that wasn't there. He'd receive his medal, shake hands with dignitaries, hear himself described as a hero, and always, underneath it all, would be the question he never asked aloud. If Mercy survived that day on Hacksaw Ridge, what part of him hadn't? The smoke cleared eventually. Okinawa ended. The war ended. Men came home and tried to live with their memories. Desmond Doss among them, carrying something heavier than medals, the knowledge that the legend everyone celebrated was true, but incomplete. He had carried Mercy through the smoke, but Mercy had carried him too, and the cost of that mutual carrying was a weight he'd feel in his trembling hands for the rest of his life. In the final official report, Hacksaw Ridge was reduced to coordinates and casualty figures. 7 men saved by extraordinary action under fire. Somewhere in the bureaucratic language was the truth, that mercy doesn't die first in war. Sometimes it dies last, after everything else is gone. And sometimes, carried by stubborn faith and fraying rope, it doesn't die at all. It just learns to live with the weight. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel. Tell us which country you watch from and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.